Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Bonjour. Prostutaya. Guten Tagen. Dzień dobry. Trava. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the village of Fairhaven. A little place that is quite of a long way out of the way of many other places here in New York State. And during these troubled times, it is a pleasure and a privilege to be able to come out here and be able to do this. Everybody, welcome to the 300 subscriber Cinemax special. And during these troubled times, I've decided to give you all the opportunity to come and do something that many haven't been able to do before. We're going to take a little trip down memory lane, and we're going to visit the village of Fairhaven. Let's go. Now, before we start on our little journey, you're probably asking, what is Fairhaven? Well, Fairhaven is a tiny village on the bay known as Little Sodus Bay, as you see behind me. Now, this is situated on the southern shore of Lake Ontario, and to be quite honest, has got to be one of the most beautiful places in New York State I have ever been. By far, you could say. Now, with Little Sodus, we need to go back in time. We need to go way back in time to understand the origin story of this place. Little Sodus Bay, a part of Lake Ontario, was carved out when the Great Ice Age glaciers began to recede about 10 to 12,000 years ago. And with that, what happened was it carved great basins out for water to fill. And as I'm showing on a map right now, you're seeing what Lake Ontario used to be known as the Great Ancient Lake Iroquois, or the Great Ancient Lake Iroquois. As you can see in the picture is that these ice sheets were massive. They were so vast. They were 2 miles high. Just imagine seeing that, a glacier towering 2 miles into the atmosphere. And from that it carved out the great lands that you see here, including the picture you saw at the beginning. Those were the bluffs. These are great sandstone deposits that were left over by the glaciers receding. And as you can imagine from seeing what Lake Iroquois looked like, the water levels that you see now, just imagine that water level being 200 feet higher than we are now. And of course, as you can see, Lake Oneida in the Finger Lakes would have been covered, Lake Cayuga would have been connected to Lake Iroquois, and Toronto and some of the Canadian peninsulas and islands above the lake would have been underwater. That's just astounding. And during the time of the Ice Age, the great ancient Native Americans and Inuit peoples who migrated here, they hunted mastodons, mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, but after the lake started to recede, after the glaciers opened up the St. Lawrence Seaway, it began to shrink down into what it is today. And as you can see, these what was said as shining silver waters by the first explorers, you could imagine just how incredible it must have been to see this back then. Just imagine what it would have been like to see that glacier here, to see all that stuff that they would have seen. But that's all history, and let's get moving on. Now, why is it called Little Sodus Bay? Well, the reason is pretty simple, alright? Now, as you can imagine, as I did say, is that back in the past, the Native Americans used to live here. Well, in Native American language, and I'm going to try and pronounce this as best as I can, Date Kayashote. Now, that technically means Little Sodus Bay. Now, why is it called Little Sodus? Well, it's because along the southern shore of Lake Ontario with the Native Americans, there were 3 Sodus Bays, alright? And it was known as the land of the 3 Soduses. About a half hour from here, that is Great Sodus Bay. Here is Little Sodus Bay. And just to the west is Blind Sodus Bay. And you're probably wondering, why is it called Blind Sodus Bay? Well, plain and simply, it's a bay that's traversed by an isthmus at the front. And there's only a tiny channel for you to get through. Compared to Great Sodus Bay and Little Sodus Bay, it's a lot harder to see unless from the air. Now you're probably wondering, why did I say shining silver waters? Because the first people who came to explore here looked at it as like the waters were like shining like silver. Because the waters were so peaceful, so calm, and it was just naturally beautiful. And as you can imagine, all that is exactly what prompted people to want to explore here more, to want to be able to come here and take a look. And of course, as you can see the bay behind me, it is beautiful. Am I right? Now for some little bit of technical specifications of Little Sodus Bay. Little Sodus Bay is about 2 miles long at its maximum point, and its widest point about 1,800 feet. On average, it averages anywhere between 3 and 35 feet deep. Now that may not sound like much, but the differences go up pretty drastically, because according to a nautical chart, the depths of the water tend to go from 3 to 9 to 12 to 25 and then down to 35. Now for some that may sound like it's deep, but the deepest parts of Lake Ontario have been shown to be as deep as 600 feet. So in actuality, that's another reason why you can call it, we can definitely call it Little Sodus Bay. But there are a few things to know as well. As you see behind me, this is Fairhaven. Well, also behind you is also Fairhaven. Fairhaven situates on both sides of the bay, but it is bordered by a few towns. On the west side, it is bordered by the town of Wolcott. On the east side, it is bordered by Sterling. And also on the south, it is bordered by Sterling. And the only two villages that are closest to it happen to be the villages of Red Creek, which is to the south-southwest, and Hannibal, which resides to the east. Now that may not sound like a far drive, but believe it or not, when you're out here, everything feels more wide open than in the big city. I'm sure many of us can relate to that. Now before we go any further into this, I wanted to give everybody a little bit of a brief, synopsis of some of the history of Fairhaven. As you probably remember, I said that this land was originally owned by the Iroquois. Now this was about 420 years ago. In 1600, when the whole area was run by the Iroquois League, which later became the Iroquois Confederacy from all the tribes. Now, it is at the top of Cayuga County, which was after the Cayuga Native Americans here. But between 1600 and 1700, a lot of exploration was done of this area. Mainly by the French, who had a lot of control in the area and in Canada. And by the 1670s, the whole southern edge of Lake Ontario had been explored. And in 1669, 3 famous French explorers came to explore here. And those were François Dollier de Casson, René de Bréhat de Galagné, and the most famous of them, Sieur de la Salle, who was known as the most famous Frenchman and one of the first Frenchmen to sail the upper Great Lakes region. Now during this time, there were still a lot of troubles between the European settlers and the Native Americans. Well, the French were some of the first to enter Canada, and during that time, when they came down here, they made great friends with the Native Americans, mainly due to the reason that because with settlement, they were adapters. They learned the ways of the Native Americans, and they learned how to trade with them. They weren't like exploiters who would just displace Native Americans for their own doing. Now, roughly for the next 100 years, there would be simple peace. However, then in the 1760s, the French and Indian War would break out. Now during that time, in 1768, the Treaty of 1768 between the French and the Cayuga Native Americans here was signed, and that therefore granted the Native Americans the rights to this land. Now it should be noted that before this, when the French first settled here, this area became known as Les Chutons, which roughly translates to a passage that leads to the Cayugas. Now that being said, is because basically almost a straight south from here is Cayuga Lake, which is one of the biggest of the Finger Lakes in the Finger Lake region. And of course, during that time, the French were having trouble with the British. So, basically this treaty was to basically provide as a further note of mutual friendship here. And then of course, in the decades after following the American Revolution, the area was mostly untouched for those decades. Now, we have to look at it and see that these areas were so beautiful, they were perfect for farming, and it had a lot of interesting things in it. Now by that I mean, like, it had plenty of primitive industry, particularly fishing. The first settlers came here in 1805, and that was to start with the town of Sterling, which is what surrounded them. And during those first years, very little would be done to show about the base, or excuse me, the bay. And when you think about it, these little industries that popped up between 1800 and 1860, you had fishing, you had ice harvesting, you had hunting a little bit, you had farming, you had grain mills, blacksmiths, gin mills, and by 1859, at 2 points on this bay, to where I look towards the south, west, that happens to be Eldridge Point. It had 2 hotels there, and also up at the northern end of the bay, which is Sabin Point, which I'll point out on a map here, there was also a hotel up there as well. Now, a funny thing you should say about that, because at Sabin Point, which you'll soon see later, is that around the turn of 1800, it was said that the creek that would go through here, Sterling Creek, which would go through the pond, was actually big enough that it actually wrapped around Sabin Point and emptied into the bay. That would have been such an incredible sight to see. Now, on a further note, it was said that at a time, the creek was actually big enough to have ships of the War of 1812 sail down them.
Oh, that's real nice.
Now, just to clarify about the ships of the War of 1812 thing in the creek, this is a very broad topic because the ships of the War of 1812 ranged anything from the following, of the smallest being the sloop, which is basically a 1 to 2 masted, very small ship with a very shallow draft and anywhere from 10 to 20 guns, up to the biggest ships that the English had, which were the ship of the line, such as HMS Victory, which had anywhere between 60 and 110 guns. Now, I cannot clarify at this time what ships would have been able to sail down the creek, because it is so hard to tell what it would have looked like long before now. But either way, it is an interesting topic to hear that such vessels would have been able to traverse that creek. If you think so, I hope you'll leave your thoughts in the comments below. As I did say earlier, the town of Sterling was first settled in about 1805. Now, as I did say also, is that with the early industries such as fishing, the grain mills, and even what was discovered to be iron ore deposits in Sterling, the area started to see a slightly rapid era of development from 1805 onwards. Now, with possible locations here, is that Sterling had a lot of the territory until the 1835 survey, which is when the towns of Sterling, Cato, and Wolcott were all put on the survey for the map. However, this did not include Fairhaven just yet. That wouldn't happen until probably about 20 to 30 years later. Now, to put in perspective of the time between the 1850s and the 1870s, this was the era of mass transport for the Great Lakes via maritime traffic. Now, it should be noted that with this traffic, it didn't come without dangers. Times on the Great Lakes were always treacherous during November, and as you could imagine, there are many wrecks that if you look on a map will always say 11 or November, meaning that they sank during the November storms here. And I have seen some of the storms here, not in November, but the storms, when they hit here, they hit hard. And with that, I speak of two specific shipwrecks associated with Fairhaven here, and that happens to be, first one is the two-masted schooner, the Etta Bell, which left here and sank due to uncontrollable leaks in 1873, and she wasn't discovered until 2006. And the second being the wooden paddle wheel steamer, the SS Bay State, which left Oswego en route to Sodus Point and Sodus Bay and Rochester, but unfortunately happened to come into a storm and it foundered with all lives aboard on November 4th, 1862. However, she laid undiscovered until more recently, until 2015, 5 years ago. And this is what happened, is that with this and the trouble that it had with the weather, something needed to be done about it. And the answer was a breakwater. Now here I stand on the break wall, as you can see, everybody. I here stand on the west break wall, and the one you see over to my left happens to be the east break wall. Now, these aren't the original break walls that were put in. The original breakwaters, also known as the piers, those ones were put in about 1872, and those were made of wood. And they were a lot thinner than these ones now. Now, those piers, as I said, were put in specifically to create this channel in order for ships to come in and out of the bay without having to worry about lake storms and all that causing any disruptions to the lake water. And in turn also keeping the waves out of the bay so it wouldn't damage the shorelines too much. Now, the wooden breakwater was very sturdy, believe it or not. In fact, showing the picture right now, what you're seeing is a picture from the aftermath of a 1907 ice storm that ripped out part of it. But yes, as you see in the picture, there were indeed lighthouses put up as well, which were definitely needed. Now, where I'm standing on this break wall is that this is the site where it used to be what was known as a range light. Now, a range light is a little bit more difficult to explain than a lighthouse, but the range light was mostly used by vessels within the bay to be able to come out without having to worry about hitting rocks or anything, or shoals. But basically, the wooden break wall lasted probably until about, say, the 1940s. And then during that time, they started construction of the new concrete ones, which are what you see today. Now, the old concrete ones were still a lot thinner and were in their prime during 1960. And then it was final that in the 1970s, that was when these modern break walls started to be built by the Army Corps of Engineers. However, as you're probably seeing with the fences behind me and the yellow braces, is that over the years, you have to remember, Lake Ontario is prone to storms, which means a lot of waves, and of course during the winter when the whole bay freezes up. And that's why you see these breakwaters have taken an absolute pounding over the years. And well, in the past couple of years, it's taking quite a toll with the high waters, because as you can see behind me, there are sections that are pulled out and where the concrete has dropped. So that clearly tells you, in a way, these things need maintenance. But you know, all in all, they've lasted a long time, and I do hope that they will continue to last for the next long time. Just a little throwback before we continue, folks. As I said before, is that farming was a big thing in New York State. Now, that wasn't one of the only industries here that made quite a revenue for some time, and still does. You gotta remember, back in the day, when families had these great, vast estates that would have dozens and dozens, or possibly even hundreds of acres of open farmland, those lands, some people still have the reason to continue doing what they love today. And one of those locations here in Fairhaven is the Colica Estate Winery. That's right. Anybody who doesn't know, here in the Finger Lakes region, the Finger Lakes is known as New York's prime wine country. That's right.
Oh, hello there.
Vineyards. Vines for the grapes to create incredible wines. And believe it or not, this one, I do have to admit, is one of the best. I personally don't drink wine, but those in my family that do, I have to tell you, they are absolutely spectacular at it. I've heard incredible reviews about the place, and if any of you want to go and sample wines, if you ever get a chance to come to the Finger Lakes region, come to the Colica Winery. I'm sure you won't be whining about it. For much of the time that Fairhaven was a village, once it was incorporated in 1880, it was pretty much like every other village. It had its perks, it had its churches, it had its hotels, it even had a public school and then a high school. Now, I put that in quotations because it said it was a high school, but it could actually host grades 1 to 12, which is pretty interesting because later on in its experience, the high school was given a further wing to it to make room for more space. But one of the more interesting places in Fairhaven that I do find very fascinating is the point you see to my right, which right now currently is known as Pearson Point. Now, the whole point, which stretches along the road known as Fancher Avenue, this stretches around what was originally known as Kaiser Point, and that was after John C. Kaiser, who bought the land for his family in 1875, I should say. Now, this, for the time being, remained as what were majority picnic grounds, which I have to say was fairly nice for the area here. And then in 1895, there was an auction held, and the gentleman by the name of J. Had Pearson bought the area. And in 1898, he renamed this point Pearson Point at the top. And as granted, it was also known by then as Ontario Park. And what happened was, in 1898, he built the Ontario Hotel at Pearson Point, which hasn't been around for a while, but for a hotel for the time, it looked considerably large for it. Also, it sort of reminded me of an old Wild West hotel, if you look at the picture I'm showing you now. And also, further down the point, in 1907, the gentleman by the name of Professor Warrington Somers built the Somers Cottage, which actually still exists there today and is actually currently on the market. This cottage was built by him, and believe it or not, you're probably wondering, if he was a professor, what did he do? Well, believe it or not, he was actually a professor at the Auburn Academic Academy. Now that, I do have to say, is quite a mouthful, with a lot of A's, you could say. And then, in 1916, it was bought by the mayor of the town of Fulton, Dr. Frank Fox, and therefore, from then on, became what was known as Fox Point. Quite an incredible thing that you can see nowadays. Now, you cannot personally see the Somers Cottage unless you can actually see it from the water. It is a very private location, and I do have to admit, it's also very roomy. And for a house that is 113 years old, it looks fabulous. So, I will definitely say, continue seeing the history, because it always shows. Now, as we take a look at this side of the bay, you're probably wondering, why did I point to a bunch of boats? Well, if you look way over there, way over where some of those roofs are on that side of the bay, back in 1911, the Garrett Coal and Ice Company built an ice house here. If you remember me saying from the ice harvest, when this bay would freeze over, the old way for people to get their food cold before refrigeration came along was putting ice in their ice boxes. And they went out and manually cut the ice into blocks and took them to this ice house. And showing the picture right now over my screen, that's basically what it looked like. And you can imagine, that's a lot of manual work, but it built up strength in people. Because back in the old days, a lot of life was so much harder than it is nowadays. Sorry, that was a car passing by. We all take for granted all this technology that we have. Life is so easy nowadays. We often take for granted just how far we've come with technology ever since the Industrial Revolution. Now, I should tell you, now I am still technically, I'm on Lake Street right now. So, as you should know, is that the ice house over there, as you saw in the picture, was at the corner of Lake Street and the street that intersects it, which is 7th Street. But more of that is technically what's known as the Lake Street extension, because way up the way, Lake Street actually goes all the way up to Sabin Point. It used to not do that, believe it or not. Back in the day, it was what was known as the Colony, as I'll show the picture right now. So you can see, there's quite a difference here and there between now and way back when. But I do have to say, as you always know, history always has a way of showing itself in many ways. And in a small village like this, it is imperative that we follow the history, because that is literally what holds the village together. Now, probably one of the best preserved structures here in Fairhaven is the structure you see behind me. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Pleasant Beach Hotel, built on the exact site it stands in 1910. It is one of the oldest and one of best preserved buildings in Fairhaven, being 110 years old and seeing like not too much would look like it has changed. Take a look at this picture from the dockside that I just pulled up. Now, a little bit of a background about the property. This was originally a part of what was known as Cottage Farm, which again was one of those big farming estates that sprouted up around the bay. And then, of course, in 1905, this site was under speculation to possibly put a hotel in. And therefore, over the next 5 years, development and plans began to come together. And in 1910, the Pleasant Beach was built. It is not so much as a hotel anymore, but back in its heyday, this place saw incredible things, such as it having vegetable gardens, tennis courts, volleyball courts, And now it's a bar and restaurant. And I know it is tricky during the coronavirus pandemic that we have now to go in, but I've been inside before, and I do have to say it is a splendid place to eat. If you ever get a chance to come here, do feel free to come check out the Pleasant Beach Hotel. Because I must say, your stay here will be almost to die for. Now, walking down the main street in Fairhaven, many of you are probably wondering, what is there to do in Fairhaven Village? Well, I'm glad you asked, because the next little compilation, I'm showing you a few little places that you guys can really have a good time in. So, without further ado, let's go take a look at them, shall we? Now here's a treat, folks. You guys ever feel hungry and you need to come get a bite to eat in Fairhaven? Why don't you come check out the Little Sodus Inn, or Big Bo's Ice Cream, or the Hardware Cafe and General Store, or Brandon's Pub and Grill, more affectionately known by some of us like me as O'Connor's Irish Pub. Say, folks, you looking for any of those interesting little gifts for anybody? Well, feel free to come out and check out one of these two stores right here. You have the Front Porch Gift Shop on my right, which has more of the summery stuff, and for more of those with the artistic nature, come check out South Shore Artisans. I'm sure you'll really be interested to see their artistic works. Or say, folks, you need groceries or something, or you're going on a trip down Route 1048 to Oswego or something, feel free to stop by the Bayside Grocery and get whatever you need. I can also recommend they got fabulous cinnamon donuts that come out on the weekends. They are great, especially when you warm them up in the microwave. Come and try that culinary perfection and see what you think. And for anybody who's interested in more culinary confections or confectional art, feel free to come check out the great Fly-By-Night Cookie Company. The cookies are outstanding. And for anybody who's a fisherman out there, any supplies that you need, say bait, tackle, boxes, poles, feel free to come here to Screwy Louie's Sports Shop. I'm sure the catches you make will really be worth your while. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, probably everybody's favorite part of Fairhaven, New York, by consensus, has got to be none other than Fairhaven Beach State Park. Let's go check out and see what we have in store, shall we? So Fairhaven Beach State Park was originally envisioned in 1925 when a group of members gathered together from the State Park Association who wanted to save and preserve this land that we stand on. And later, 2 years later, in 1927, the park became a reality. So you just think about it. This park, this year, 2020, is 93 years old. Is that not incredible? Now you're probably wondering, well, what does this park have to offer? Well, for example, you could go on playgrounds, go camping, like my family has been since 1976 here, go fishing on the pond and up Sterling Creek, go kayaking or canoeing, go fishing in the channel between the lake and the pond. Go hike the Bluff Nature Trail. Come take a walk on any of the piers, including this famous one everybody knows as the Broken Pier, shaped and ravaged by the storms that have come through the lake. If you want to come out, test your spirit, your stamina, and your courage. Or of course, the best activity to do in Fairhaven is come to the exact thing that the sign says. Let's all go to the beach. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before I say anything else, I just want to say I'm glad you've actually managed to make it this far through the video. But when we look at the history of Fairhaven and we see Fairhaven Beach State Park, all of this wouldn't have been on the map if it was for one thing. Now, you try and think for a moment what that is. Still have no idea? Well, let me tell you all, here is the answer. The reason Fairhaven exists today is because what you see behind me, the big elevated hill in the trees, That is a part of the caveat that came through the town. And what was that caveat? That caveat was the town's existence thanks to the railroads. Beginning in the 1850s, railroads in New York State began to explode across the way. Even though the railroads in New York State started in 1831 with the train known as the DeWitt-Clinton running along the Hudson River, many railroad companies seemed to have this urge to want to exploit this open terrain and be able to expand out across the lands of New York State. There were many railroads, as you can see by this map, that wanted to get across from New York City at the lowest end to Buffalo, my home city, on the Great Lakes, so it could connect with the trade on the Great Lakes of the great steamships that went from the lakes to the oceans and through all the canals. Now, in regards to Fairhaven, the way it is you look at the map here, it shows Fairhaven at the northern end of this map. Let's take a closer look right now. Looking at the zoomed-in part of the map, we can see that Fairhaven is indeed on this railroad map. Now, in this area of central New York, the way it worked is that there were a few major railroads that ran through here. First, it was the New York Central's Buffalo to Syracuse route, which ran through Syracuse to Albany, which was often known as the water level route due to the Erie Canal. The tracks going to Fairhaven started with the Southern Central Railway in Auburn, going northwards towards Throop, Weedsport, Brickchurch, Cato, Ira, Martville, Sterling. And as it got to Sterling, it crossed the Sterling Junction with the railroad known as the Rome, Watertown, and Ogdensburg Railway, which later also became part of the New York Central. Now, as we look at this overhead view of Sterling Junction, we can see a few things. First off, the railroad doesn't say the Rome, Watertown, and Ogdensburg Railway. It was originally a shorter line known as the Lake Ontario Shore Railroad, and crossing that at the junction was the Southern Central. Now, here there was positioned a station, a tower, and a hotel. And as you can see, it ran between Red Creek and Oswego through Hannibal, and the other went towards Fairhaven and south towards Martville. And there was also what was known as a Y. The reason why is because, well, they were shaped like Ys, as you can clearly see here. But let's take a closer look at where this all really started, shall we? Now, before we get to the railroad in Fairhaven, we gotta go way back. We gotta go back until at least the mid-1850s, when railroads were starting to explode over the Northeast. And right now I'm here in Red Creek, which is one of the nearest little villages to Fairhaven, New York. And what you see behind me is, in fact, the old Red Creek Depot, the railroad depot that served the railroad through here. It all started in the 1850s when the Rome, Watertown, and Ogdensburg Railway rolled through here on its way to Oswego and Watertown, as you can probably guess. However, then later on, in probably, say, the 1880s to 1890s, the New York Central Railway bought out the railroad here. This line would later be known as what was known as the Hojack Line. Now, what you're probably wondering is, what does Hojack mean? Well, it's an exclamation term from the old railway. And how it worked was, when people were moving with cars, and if somebody swooped to something, they would usually go, "Whoa, Jack." However, over time, this became known as Hojack. Now, many of you may be looking at that structure and thinking, how's that a train depot? Take a look at this picture from the Herbert Trice collection that I've been granted use by, and tell me that you see a striking example. You see it now? So this is probably the closest railroad depot to Fairhaven. And of course, the buildings are still all original, just repainted a little bit. But we're not going to continue sticking around on the New York Central main line, as you see on my hat here. We got to get more specific. So, without further ado, let's go take a look and see what is left of what we can tell from Fairhaven's railway past. Now, over here on Sterling Station Road in the town of Sterling, this is where the railroad history of Fairhaven began. Now, you're probably looking at this and wondering, this doesn't look like a railroad, it looks like just an old trail or a driveway. Well, as it turns out, yes, you are correct, it is a trail, but I'm going to turn the camera and I'm going to show you a picture that shows you what this looked like when it used to be Sterling Junction. You try and tell me that this isn't a used to be a track after that. Now, do you believe me? If you don't, well, I'm sorry that you still don't. This is where the two railway lines intersected. Now, you're also probably wondering, well, where did the station and the old tower that stood there go? Sadly, the station was torn down, but the tower does exist still to this day. Where do you ask? Why, the tower happens to be right here at the Sterling Museum, perfectly restored to its original condition, along with a recent guest here and a new resident. This happens to be a caboose that was used by the Rome, Watertown, and Ogdensburg, and then the New York Central's Hojack line. So you can see, there's still history tied in here. But you know something? We're getting off topic here. Let's get back to the railroad history of Fairhaven itself. So here we are back in Fairhaven. This is exactly opposite of where Screwy Louie's is. Now you remember that trail that used to be the train tracks? Well, dig this, the tracks used to come right through here. And if you look behind me, those old ruins there, I'm pretty sure are the old ruins of the old station there. Now what I've seen from this property is that it had the station, it had the old canning factory, and it also had an old church. You'll look at the overhead map in the Fairhaven book and you'll see this. Now, a little bit of context. The first tracks didn't start being laid in Fairhaven until 1869. However, the concept of having the railroad here began long before 1859 with the first map that was put of Fairhaven that showed the railroad that would have come through. And the reason why was because this was to become the latest part of the railroad, so it could connect from way in New York State to the lake and have the lake traffic. As I did say, you had the trestle over there, and the trestle was built in 1871 along with the breakwaters. And of course, that was when the first train ran through Fairhaven. On Wednesday, November 4th, 1871, the first train of the Southern Central Railroad ran through Fairhaven for the first time. Actually, excuse me, it wasn't November 4th, it was November 29th. And, believe it or not, ran right through this area. Now, I will let you know this. You'll see pictures of where the tracks used to run through, of old Railroad Avenue, and where the trestle used to be. Let's take a look at those right now. Now the tracks would have come down this right of way here, what is now Wildwood Road. When you look at the map, the tracks would have been going So if any of you are wondering about the trestle, as I just said before, the trestle came up here along this area of landfill, which used to be nothing but water before the turn of the 20th century. As the picture from the colony shows, there used to be nothing but houses up there before it was turned into the Park Service. Now a lot of you may be looking at this and be wondering, well, how do you know that a trestle stood here when you can't really see it except in old pictures? Very simple. Those right there, those are the old concrete abutments that the trestle stood on. So therefore, the remnants of the trestle are still here. You just need to know how to look. Unfortunately, the trestle was not without its tragedies. When on May 11th, 1917, there were two ships tied up to the trestle. And this was the SS Lloyd S. Porter and the SS Kongerkoll. For some mysterious reason, the Lloyd S. Porter had a fire break out in its engine room. Unfortunately, that fire spread out through the whole ship. And unfortunately, it burned the poor ship to the waterline. Its wreckage was towed from the trestle area over to shortly behind the breakwater, and that was the old breakwater, the wooden one. Sadly, it would stay there for quite a while before it was just removed. Maybe there might be still pieces of wreckage down there. Who knows? The second ship that was there was the Kongerkoll. The rear end of the ship caught fire, and it had to be taken away from the trestle. It was taken further down to a property that is at the end of 12th Street, that is now a part of the Park Service with the little cottages along the bay there. Along that area, there was a place known as Railroad Avenue, because all that area used to be nothing but railroad coal and loading yards. And also showing from a picture right now, it was also where the old steamer Arundel came into the bay. Traveling between Rochester and the Thousand Islands, it always made a stop here, and it ran between 1899 and 1908. And that is where the Kongerkoll settled to the bottom. And there it stayed for quite a while until, unfortunately, in the winter, the ice crushed the hull. However, believe it or not, a lot of the wreckage is still there. My cousin and I personally pulled some chains out of the bay, and believe it or not, at the Sterling Historical Museum, I got a chance to see the old steam whistle from the Kongerkoll. And believe it or not, it was also said that one of its boilers is still in the bay. Now, unfortunately, that's not the only tragedy that happened here in regards to maritime and railroad disasters. A little bit up the way, there was a private property, which we had actually sailed by before. And the resident there said that because my dad felt like he was standing on the wreck of like an old rail car. As it turns out, in 1904, an old barge that was there caught fire and sank. So that's another wreck that is in the bay. Also, I don't know how this happened, but the picture I'm showing you now is of a coal car that ran away off the trestle and was hanging precariously off the edge with its rail bogie where the wheels were dangling off the edge. I do not know how this happened, but it definitely gives an idea of just how dangerous railroad work can be, which a lot of people still don't seem to understand nowadays. But we'll get into that on another video. Let's continue on with the little railroad journey, shall we? So now that you saw those pictures and those videos, it goes to show you just how much the railroad was the lifeblood of Fairhaven. Now, a few specifics. First off, the railroad names. It started in 1871 as the Southern Central Railway. As you see an old picture right now, that picture was showing from North Fairhaven with the old classic cars, and you saw how small those rail cars were. However, in 1887, the Southern Central was bought out by the Lehigh Valley Railway. Now, that meant passenger travel could come through here. Now, the unfortunate thing for the railways of Fairhaven was time, because over the years, as roads started coming out, planes started flying, the railroad started to become less and less popular with transporting goods. The unfortunate thing was, a lot of things happened during that time, and the rails just continued to go down and down and down in service. The first sad part was when the last passenger train rolled out of Fairhaven in the 1930s. After that, no passenger trains ever came to Fairhaven again. And over the next decade and a half, less and less trains would be coming to the little village of Fairhaven. And sadly, on May 17th, 1937, sadly, the trestle started to be taken down. Excuse me, it was May 15th, I apologize. And then, the horrible news, as shown in this next paper, is that on February 27th, 1953, the final train rolled out of Fairhaven for the last time. And since then, there has been less and less activity in Fairhaven. The property behind me, you see, used to be open to bike through, but it has been bought out and is subject to redevelopment. I happen to speak with the owner of the property, who I'm going to keep anonymous right now, and I'll be honest with you, he's a really nice guy. Given the circumstances of redevelopment, he has not given me permission for it. However, you may think that that's a bad thing. Well, just remember, he's the owner of private property, and I'm just somebody from out of town wanting to do a historic video shoot. Either way, I still respect this, and I gotta tell you, it just really, really made me sad to see how the rails couldn't survive here. There are remnants here and there that you will find, but you really have to dig for it. And still, the remnants of the railroad, like I said, are still there, because for so long, that was basically the lifeblood of this town. And I do have to say, I had to stop myself several times over the years when thinking about this, about what would it have been like to see someone just lay down a mock-up railway here, just to give people an idea of what it used to be here, and just how life thrived around the railroad. But all I can say is, it's history. And with everything history, a lot of times after a while, if it's not taken care of, it just fades away. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the services to Fairhaven of one of the greatest men to ever serve it. The portrait you see before you is of a Mr. Nelson Di Gregorio, also known by me as the Captain. Why this is because Mr. D, as he was commonly known, was a World War II veteran and bomber pilot. Piloting the B-17 Flying Fortress named Misrian List, he fought over Europe and had some of the greatest courage you could ever see. And from 1958 to 2017, when he passed away, he delightfully served the people of Fairhaven with honor, courage, and commitment. What I do ask now is that we all stop and we give a salute to him as I play Taps, which happens to be by the United States Army Ceremonial Band. So everyone please, a moment of silence for the fallen of one of the greatest men to serve Fairhaven. Taps, taps, taps. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is what is Fairhaven. What it was, what it is, but who wonders what it's going to be? We've seen all these updates in the recent years, and yet it still feels like something might be missing. So, I want you all to just think about this in the comments. Let me know, should something be done to preserve more of Fairhaven's past? Should something be done in case they want to do, say, something that represents the railroad more? Let me know what you guys think all in the comments. And to credit these, I have to thank everybody. I gotta thank the mayor of Fairhaven for giving me support, the anonymous owner of the private property, at least giving the consideration. I'd like to thank Syracuse author Richard F. Palmer, a dear friend of mine and Army veteran, who gave me a lot of the pictures from Mr. Herbert Trice's collection, who has been passed away a few years now. If you are interested in his books, do feel free to let me know in the comments, and we might be able to see what we can do. And if you are interested in reading about Fairhaven, feel free to look up the book called Looking Back at Fairhaven, New York, and Little Sodus Bay 2. Because I guarantee, when you get a chance to read these books, and you get a chance to listen to these stories from here, and you get a chance to come here and see this natural beauty, it definitely makes you feel like you can just let yourself go from everything in life. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes my 300 subscribers cinematic special. I do hope that you all will share it, feel free to leave comments, and let everybody know that there is a world away from all civilization. You just gotta be willing to look. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I do hope you'll subscribe and share and support me on Patreon and Discord. And feel free to come and follow me on Twitch. I do live streams on there when I can. And feel free to follow my YouTube channel. I am the Tank Commander. And everybody, thank you so much for helping me get to 300 subscribers. Let's see this get to 400, and let's show a little love and care to Fairhaven, New York. I am the Tank Commander, and thank you for watching.